teacher and trade union organiser, joins me on the line. Martin, thank you for your time this morning. Fairly staggering figures then revealed yesterday. More than 1/5 of state secondary school pupils in England are at home. Is that because of the positive tests they've had for COVID, or do you think their parents just want to keep them home?
It's a whole range of things, but it is all down to COVID. Some will have actually tested positive themselves. Others will be isolating because they know they've been near others that have tested positive or may have tested positive. So it's a range of issues, but it's down to COVID. It's down to the impact. This is inevitable because while the rest of the world has been told that, keep your distance, wear your mask, follow a lockdown, schools have just been told, keep calm, carry on, pack your classes full of children, inadequate ventilation. This was the inevitable result.
Part of the reasoning, I think, behind England going into a 4-week lockdown, and indeed we've seen similar lockdowns in other parts of the country as well, but part of that was intended to protect schools, wasn't it? Or at least to protect the ability of schools to stay open. Do you think it was a mistake to have prioritised that?
The problem is I think it was denying reality. It was just hoping that you could keep schools open by the pretense that children and schools weren't, in fact, one of the main vectors for the virus. So Test and Trace are now reporting that the most frequently reported venue to them is schools. The ONS statistics are showing that school children have the highest rates of test positivity. So it was a problem which they should have recognised was going to happen, that you can't have a proper lockdown if you keep the schools open with the effect that that's going to have on spreading the virus. And that's now having the effect, of course, of this chaotic situation where so many students are not actually in school and in a completely unplanned way as well.
The numbers are fairly staggering. Nearly 3/4 of secondary schools in England have at least one pupil self-isolating because of a suspected case of coronavirus. The number of secondaries with at least one COVID case, as I say, nearly 3/4, 73%, and that is rising. It's risen by nearly 10% in just 7 days. Would it ever have been possible, do you think, to make schools COVID compliant? Let's take it in two sections here. Primary schools, firstly. I don't have kids, I'm not a dad, but I imagine trying to explain and persuade a 5-year-old of the importance of wearing a mask, for example, is as close to as impossible as makes no odds. And in secondary schools, would it have been possible to arrange the operations in such a way that ensured everybody was socially distant?
I think most schools have done everything that they could do. They've got masks in corridors, they've got the hand sanitizer around and so on. But the reality is it's the density of individuals. Everybody else is being told to keep their distance. If you have 30 or more children and adults in one classroom, probably with pretty poor ventilation, apart from keeping the windows open and it's getting cold, it's a recipe that means it is inevitable. You can't make that situation safe, which is why what they should have done far earlier, what the DfE's own plans were at the end of August, was to say that if things get really bad, we have to bring in rota learning, where not everybody is in at the same time, people can keep their distance, and the chances of getting infected go down automatically as well. That's what they should have done, and that's what I think they need to do now. Rather than this unplanned chaos, where nobody knows who's going to be in 1 week or the next, have planned rota learning, where parents and schools know who's going to be in 1 week, who's going to be in the next week. That way you could try and keep control of what at the minute is clearly going out of control.
But are you aware of any evidence that the spread of COVID in schools is spreading out into the wider population, into the older and elder parts of the demographic? Because that would be of medical concern, with very, very few and tragic exceptions. If a younger person, if a child or a teenager contracts COVID or tests positive for COVID, they're very likely to suffer no medical ill effects or any serious medical ill effects. Is there evidence that this contagious cohort is passing on COVID to parts of the population that will suffer more severely?
Absolutely there is. There are more and more medical studies internationally that showing that is the case. The reason it's been hidden is precisely what you said, and the difficulty for schools is precisely that because most children don't necessarily show any symptoms, most of them haven't been tested, and therefore, actually, it's unclear who in the class in front of you is, if you like, the potential carrier and who isn't. But I've got one school near me, I won't use the name, although it has been in the press locally, up here in the northwest, where because they had an outbreak, they did a test on all of the students in the school. 29% of them were positive. So if you think that that might be the situation in other schools, there's no reason why that one perhaps should be any different. That is a huge proportion, potentially, of children. Inevitably, some of those are going to carry that virus back to their families, to their vulnerable relatives, and that is exactly the concern we have.
Because we've talked a lot about schools, Martin, on this programme over the course of the year, as indeed have many of my colleagues here on LBC as well, trying to get a sense of whether parents are generally behind the idea that schools had to reopen for the sake of their child's education, or whether they tend towards believing that schools can't be made COVID secure and that it's better for everyone's sake to keep schools still closed. What is your sense of where that balance lies? You're a teacher, you're a trade union organiser. Where do you think the majority of parents are on this?
Look, I think at the beginning of term, everybody hoped for the best. They wanted it to work. School staff were like that. Parents were like that. They wanted children back in the place where they learn the best, in a school. But those of us who were warning that, hope, you can't build things on hopes, I think more and more people are realising now, because parents, they don't know whether they're suddenly going to have to take time off work because they're going to get that phone call saying your child's got to come home because they've got to isolate, because that teachers can't come in, so we can't keep your class open. So I think people are increasingly realising it doesn't make sense for us to pretend that everything else in lockdown but keep schools open. So, I think the government's got to listen. They seem to be in denial. They've got to listen, and I think parents and staff together would be far, far happier if there was a planned, organised way of reducing school numbers, doing it in a planned way where you could support students at home and support students in school, which was, of course, what we did at the beginning of the whole outbreak in the first place.
We talked last night on the programme about the vaccine and about the vaccines, which will hopefully be rolled out sooner rather than later. And our question was really about the priority that should be given to certain people of certain ages. Is there a case for vaccinating children, particularly young children, relatively early in this process as a way of arresting the spread?
Well, I'm no medic, so I think you have to ask the medical people. But what I would say is that you've got to look at the stats. And if the stats are saying that schools are areas where the virus is being identified and that children have a high test positivity, then clearly school staff and school students need to be on that list. They can't be forgotten and left down the bottom. And the problem is, at the minute, there seems to be this outlook from the government that schools, let's just keep our fingers in our ears, nothing to do with schools. That's got to change. Schools certainly need to be on that list alongside everybody else. And let's hope we get there and it works as quickly as possible.
Just a word on the educational consequences or the effects of children not having formal education for extended periods of time. Many parents did their best, and many parents for the very first time had to be teachers as well as parents over the course of 2020. But what sort of effect does that have on children's education if they are deprived of formal education for an extended period?
We should try and avoid that by doing something planned now. In other words, not go to closure, but go to a planned rota where children are in for some of the time and out for some of the time. If we don't do that, then unfortunately I think that is what we will end up with. If we're already in the situation where nearly a quarter of secondary school students are not in school right now, those numbers will just keep going up. Yes. So we'll end up with a de facto kind of closure for many students. The government need to think ahead now about the summer exams. They were in a position last summer where they didn't really recognise the uproar there would be. So they need to think about what they're doing for the exams, because inevitably there will be an effect. There is already an effect. As I say, we're not saying close schools, let's just have all the children at home. What we're saying, let's doing it in a planned way, rather than just at the minute denying it's happening and then the chaos is just happening around us. That's the reality. At the minute, we have so many schools that are already affected. Those numbers are going to get higher unless we act. And that's what the government has got to do.
Martin, thank you very much.